Hi everyone, thanks so much for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. Before we bring on tonight's guest, if you've had a Dogman encounter and would like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. If you've had a Sasquatch sighting and would like to be a guest on Bigfoot Eyewitness Radio, please go to bigfooteyewitness.com and submit a report. There was a guest I had planned to bring on tonight's show and interview, but unfortunately I caught them in a lie. If I catch a supposed eyewitness lying to me once, how can I believe anything that they say from that point on? So much for that. Well, that left me in a tight spot, so I contacted Marvin Allen to see if he'd be willing to come back on and fill that spot, and lucky for us, he agreed to do that, so here we are. Marvin, thanks so much for coming back on, especially under such short notice. I really appreciate it.
No problem, Vic. Thanks for having me back on.
Well, it's great having you back. As you know, you're always welcome here. It's always a treat to have you. So thanks again for your time. Well, Marvin, I don't need to tell you what the listeners are waiting for, so let's give it to them now. Whenever you're ready, please do what you do best.
Thanks, Vic. Again, thanks for having me back on the show again. This first encounter, it happened with this eyewitness that I was fortunate to talk to. And he's a truck driver. And he had a certain route that he had to take. And he said he had to go through Kentucky, one of his regular routes. So he gets to this truck stop. And when he gets to this truck stop, you know, it's several other truckers there. Some that he knew, some that he didn't know. So he pulls over, gets out, goes in, and gets something to eat like he always do. Now, mind you, one at a time, the truckers started to leave. So he wound up being the last person to leave out. So as he coming out from eating his food, he's walking back over to his truck. And while he walking back over to his truck, now mind you, what I didn't tell you, he said there was like a small patch of woods where he was parked at. So he walking back over to his truck. And as he walking, he noticed something on the passenger side at the front, right there with a light at, he says. But he don't know what it is. So he runs down there. And when he goes and checks around his truck, because he don't know if it's somebody trying to break in it, you know, get in his truck or something like that. So he gets to the front of the truck. And this what he tells me he noticed. He said he noticed a foul odor, but he couldn't explain it. And I asked him. He said it smelled like urine. And it's like rotten meat, like a skunk would smell. This is what he said it smelled like. So he looks up into the small patch of woods, but he don't see nothing. And now he thinking, I know a person can't run that fast, you know, because I would have seen him. So he pays it no mind. He gets in his truck, backs out, and he continues to go to his next stop. So he driving. And as he driving, he gets some calls from a friend of his on the CB. They talking. And he tell his friend, he said, you know what just happened? His friend say, what? He said, I seen something around my truck. I don't know what it was. It was just dark. And I'm thinking it's a person that was trying to break in my truck. He said, but when I get down there to the front, I don't see nobody. And I know a person can't run that fast. So they going back and forth talking. So he said, well, I'll hit you back when I get to my next spot. So he continued to drive. Now, mind you, He said now it's about 2 in the morning and he's still driving. He said he's tired and he's sleeping. He said so when he get to the next rest stop, he gonna just go ahead and get some sleep, because he been driving for a lot of hours. So he starts to drive slow. 25 miles an hour is what he told me. He said because he was tired and he didn't want to, drive too fast. So as he driving, he hears something. Boom, boom. He hears something hit the back of his rig. So he looks out the driver's side rear view. He sees nothing. And he looks out the passenger side rear view. He still see nothing. Now, mind you, he started to think that maybe it was something in the back, maybe fell. And that's where the knocking came from. And then he said, no, that can't be it because everything is tied down tight. So he continued to drive. Drive some more, he said. A few minutes passed. He hear the knocking again. Boom, boom. So he slows down a little more, like 15 miles per hour, he said. So he slowed down. He looks again through the driver's side rear view. He sees nothing. He looks through the passenger side rear view. He still see nothing. So now he thinking, I know I'm not going crazy. I hear knocks. I hear bumps. So he say he pays it no attention again. Now, mind you, he just trying to get to the next rest stop so he can get some sleep because he's tired. So he said about 5 more minutes passed by. This time, it's louder. And it's more of them. Boom, 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 boom. So he stopped. He sets up. He looks again out the driver's side rear view. He sees nothing. Then he looks out the passenger side rear view. When he looks out the passenger side rear view, he said at first, he see these bright yellow eyes. But mind you, they hop off the ground. And he looking. He said that's when he noticed 2 ears just pop up. Boop. He said they pop straight up. He said, whatever this thing is, because he didn't know what it was at the time, whatever this thing is, it had to be standing up. And he said this thing had to be huge. Now at this time, he only see the ears and the eyes. Then he focuses in. He slides over. He leans over to that passenger side rear view. That's when he could see this thing peeping around the bed of the truck. He looking because now he's shocked. Now he know what was making that knocking noise. He said he rolls down his window a little bit, not much, just a little. He said, and when he did that, that's when he could hear this thing that was standing behind his truck starts to growl. He said, and this thing growled. And when it did that, he hurried up and rolled that window up because now he's scared. He got back over in his seat, but he's still looking out the rear view passenger side window. He said that's when this thing came from behind. He said when it came from behind, he almost fainted of what he saw. He said this thing looked just like a werewolf. And he said when it stepped from behind the bed of that truck, it just stood there. He said that's when he just cranked it up and started to drive. He said he got up to 45. He said, but this thing is right there running behind his truck. And he said, as he driving, this thing stayed perfectly right at the back of his truck. And when he would get a certain feet, boom, boom, boom. He said he kept hitting his truck. He said he'd get up to 50. He said this thing is still keeping up with him. Now he said while he driving, he noticed that the rest stop is coming up at the next right. So he gets to this exit and he turns off and he's driving down. And as he's driving down, this thing is still right there. So when he looked at the sign, he said it read half a mile, to the next rest stop. So he driving. But as he driving, this thing is still hitting the bed as it's truck. Boom, boom. So he gets about, he said it had to be no more than 50 feet before he would turn in to get to this rest stop. He said just before he was about to turn in, he pulled on the brakes again. He said, but this time when he pulled on the brakes again, he just hears something. Boom. Smacks into the back of the truck. So now he stopped. And when he stopped, he just heard this loud thump. Boom. On the top of his, the bed of the truck. And this thing just was walking. Boom, 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 boom. He said this thing was heavy. He said this thing get all the way up to where he at. He said this thing took another one leap, bam, and landed in the front of his truck. He said now he could see this creature. He said when it landed, it turned and it faced him. He said this thing had to be almost as tall as the truck part that he was in. Said this thing was huge. He watching it. Now I asked him, I said, when that thing landed in front of your truck, what did you see? He said this thing looked like a werewolf. He said it had eyes that just seemed like they just glowed. It had shoulders, long arms. He said this thing had hands. He said, but it had canine legs. He said it was dark in color. He said, but he don't think that it was black. He said because he could see brown in this thing. So if he had to guess a color, he said he would say this was a dark brown color. He said this thing is just still standing there and it's breathing hard. It's breathing hard and it's breathing heavy. He said he beeps his horn, that loud horn that truckers make. He said he beeping that. He said, but this thing did something. He said it's like that horn irritated him or something. He said because every time he would let that horn go, this thing just kept showing its teeth. He said in the way it was doing it, it was like, he said, like how a person would, grit their teeth. He said it wasn't gritting his teeth. He said it would show all his teeth. And it seemed like it was just how a person would bite down on their teeth. He said to him, that's what it looked like. He said, and he just kept beeping that horn. He said because he think that it irritated this creature a lot. He said after a few more seconds of beeping that horn, that creature took another leap and leaped into the tree line and just took off. He said he sat there for about 15 seconds and then he just drove and he pulled into the rest stop. Said he called his friend and he told him, he said, you will never believe what I just saw. He said his friend said, what? He said, man, I saw a werewolf. He said, man, is you drunk? He said, man, I knew I shouldn't have told you that. And his friend was like, nah, man, he said, but he hung up. He said, because he was hurt about the situation because he didn't believe him when he first told him. He said he couldn't really get no sleep because he was thinking about that thing and he didn't know if it was around. And I asked him, I said, have you ever seen these things? And he was like, never. I hunt, I fish, never seen this thing out there. And I told him that, it was called the Dogman, and some of them do look like werewolves. So that was his encounter. Now my next encounter happened in the Carolinas. Now, she don't want to give me the town and everything, so I respect that. I was just happy to get, her encounter. Now, she said that she worked for social service for years, and she was coming up on retirement, and she always wanted to buy her own home. But until then, she would just stay where she was at. Now, mind you, she said she was staying in a trailer park. Now, the trailer park that she stayed in had several other residents, living, in a little small community. She said she loved animals, cats, dogs. Said she was the type that if she was coming home and she seen a stray, she would take them in. And she said she did that on, several occasions. Now, mind you, some of the neighbors was getting really irritated by her because she was taking in so many strays. But she kept them in the back of her house, confined. She had got somebody to build a little cage where they could, stay out there and didn't have to be all on people's property and stuff like that. So she kept them pretty much on her side of her home. But they always complained. Now, when I was talking to this eyewitness, she said that the trailer park that she was staying in wasn't really big, but it was surrounded by woods. And just behind this trailer park, she said it was like a pond back there. Not a real big pond, but she said it was a pond back there. And, the neighbors used to go back there and fish because this pond had fish in there. And she said sometimes she used to like to just go down there and just sit, just to get away, clear head. So she said one day when she was in the house, she get a call from one of the neighbors. And when she answered the phone, she said that the neighbor said, "Did you just see that out back?" And she was like, "See what?" And her neighbor said, I don't know what it was, but she said it looked like a great big dove out there just inside of the tree line. And it was walking. Now, mind you, none of the neighbors had doves. Only one had pets, was her. So she was like, "No, I didn't see nothing. I was just sitting in here looking at TV, playing with my house cat, rubbing them and stuff." So she said, "Go to your back and look out there because it's still out there." So she said she gets up, she goes and she looks. She looks through her patio and she looks out back. So when she looked out the patio window, she could see a dark figure. Now, mind you, the moon was out, she said. You can't see deep up in the woods, but the light from the moon casted just enough light where you could see just right there at the beginning of this tree line. Now, her neighbor said, when I saw it, it was walking. But while they on the phone talking, it's just sitting there. They didn't see no eyes. They didn't see nothing. So they thinking that this thing must have been facing with their back to them. So they still talking on the phone. That's when they said, both of them, this thing it shot up into the tree line like it's going towards where this pond at. And she said, "Did you see that?" And the neighbor said, "Yeah, I seen it." "What you think it was?" They going back and forth about what they think it was. It was like, "I don't know. I just thought it was a dove." And she said, "But don't nobody around here has no dove." So they go back and forth. They talk. Finally finished talking and hang up the phone. Next day, she go to work. But she's still thinking about what she saw. Say she get off work, she stop past the store, and then she go home. She feeds her cats and everything. Now, mind you, she said she kept the stray cats that she used to find outside in the lower confinement that she had built for them. So she would feed them and everything. So said she did that. She goes in the house, relax, She said later on that afternoon, probably like 5 or 6, she said she fixing something to eat. She goes in there and she started to watch TV. She said while she was sitting down watching TV, she just hear, meow, cats just making noise out back. So she's saying she ain't paying no attention because she heard this before. Cats going crazy. And she was like, "Shut up." This is what she said. She said, "Just shut up," like she can tell them shut up and they're going to shut up. But she don't know what's going on out back. So the noise, they're around, making all this noise. She said again, shut up. So she said she gets up. And when she gets up, slides her doors open, and she goes out back. And when she goes out back, and this just is crazy. She said she saw nothing but carnage. She goes out back and she looks. She hits the light on her patio porch, and she looks. And she said these cats just ripped apart. A head over here, the body over there, legs over there. She said whatever this was just tore these cats to pieces. So she walks to the front. Now, mind you, she said she didn't have a lock on this, this confinement that she had them in. She said because it wasn't, like she didn't need a lock because it wasn't like people was coming around stealing cats. She had the kind of lock that you could she said that you could flip up. It was shaped like I'm going to say like a U, those kind of locks. And she said that was up on the gate. So if anybody wanted to come in, all they had to do was lift it up. She said she goes out there and, cats they just dead. But she said she looks over behind one of the, cat houses, and she sees a small one in the back, and it's alive. So she picks it up. And when she picks it up, this small one got blood on it. So she thinking, is it hurt? But it's not. She said it's blood from these other cats. And when she leave back out, she looks. And when she looks, she says she can see a trail of body parts from these cats. And it's leading right there to the tree line. She said she walks about 10 feet. She said, but something in her mind told her to stop. Don't go no further. She says she don't know where this came from, but she could clearly hear something say stop and don't go no further. So she said that's what she did. She said she turns around with the cat, the small one, and she goes in the house. She goes in the house, and she said if I was late, she couldn't call nobody to come out. So the next day, when she gets up, she calls animal control, and she calls the local sheriff to come out. So they come out. When they come out, she takes them around back, and they look, and they see the carnage, and they ask her, well, what happened? Do you have any stray dogs around here? They asked her all a bunch of questions, and she was like, no. She said, but me and my neighbor did see a large, what looked like to me was a large black dog inside the tree line the other day. So the sheriff, animal control, they walks around and they looks, doing their little, what I call a little phony investigation. So they walks around, they walks in the woods, they walks all the way down there to the pond with her. So they talking the whole time, and they was like, well, I think it just, Doug must have came and, just killed all your cats. So they talk for a while. They get, clean up all the mess and stuff. And they takes it off. And she gave them a report. So she was like, well, what if I see this thing again? This black, my neighbor said it's a black Doug. They said, well, just call us if you see it again. So they wind up leaving. So they leave. She back in the house. She calls her neighbor. And she tells her neighbor, she was like, I called the sheriff, animal control. They came out. They said that any of us had Dougs. And I told them no, but me and you saw one the other night. So they stayed on the phone talking, going back and forth. So she hangs up the phone. She goes back in there and watch TV. Now, mind you, she said the trailer that she stayed in only had one bedroom because it was just her. So she said she watches TV for a while. And she said she find herself dozing off at times. So she said around 11 o'clock, she gets up, decides to go in there and go to bed. So she goes in her room and she lays down. Now, mind you, she takes the small cat in there with her and, put it in the bed with her. So she said she was laying down. She said just about when she was about to doze off, that's when she heard this howl. She said this howl sounded like it was so close, like it was at her window. She said she heard this howl. And she sat up in her bed and said, what the? So she calls her neighbor. Neighbor picks up the phone. She said, did you hear that? She said, yeah, I heard. So while they was on the phone talking, she heard the howl again. So she said, look, I'm going to have to call you back. So they hangs up the phone. So she said after sitting up in her bed for about 5 minutes, she didn't hear it no more. So she laid back down. She said, so as she was laying down, looking up at her ceiling, that's when she heard, boom, boom. She hear what she said sounded like something banging on the side of her home. She sits up again. Boom, boom, boom. Then she slides to the edge of the bed and she stands up. She stands up and she walks out her room. She said when she walks out her room, she grabs the broom. She said she don't know why she grabbed the broom, but she grabbed it. She walked towards the living room. She stood and she looked at her back patio doors. And while she was looking at her patio doors, she see a shadow just shoot past. And while the shadow shoots past, she said her head followed it. And she was like, what is that? She said because the shadow that she saw, it was up high. It wasn't down low. She said this shadow was up high. This dark silhouette. It was up high, she said. So she said she walked a little closer towards the back patio doors. And she stopped. And she looked. And she listened. She said, and as she was standing there listening, she hear the knocks again. Boom, boom, boom. It's on the opposite side of the house. She said to herself, what is that? So she walked closer to the patio doors and she stopped. She peeks out the curtain to her right in the direction of this thing ran. She peeks out the curtain, but she don't see nothing. She said just when she was about to turn around and leave and go back in her room, boom, she hear a heavy thump land on her back porch. She peeks out the window again. She said, but this time when she peeked out the window, she could see this thing coming in the view. Boom, boom. She said this thing took a few steps and then stopped. She said, and this thing stopped right at the corner of the window. And it just stood there. Like this thing knew where she was at. She said it stopped right there at the corner of the window. She said, so she eased the curtains closed. She said that's when this thing stepped out. And when it stepped out, it turned and it faced her. She said she was so scared and just in shock that she couldn't move. She said that's when this thing leaned over and had what she said, his nose on the back patio door. And she said this thing was breathing. She can hear through the door. Said this thing was breathing heavy. She said she was so scared she couldn't move. She said that's when this thing raised what she said was a hand. And when it did that, it just went that, 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 that. Like this thing was trying to get her attention. Like this thing knew she was in that exact spot. She said, and after this thing tapped, it put its hands back down in front. She said, so she started to walk backwards from the window. And she said, as she was walking backwards from the window, that's when this thing started to growl. She said it made this low growl that just vibrated through her. So she stopped. And when she stopped, the growl stopped. Now, mind you, she said it wasn't real late, and a lot of her neighbors worked in the daytime. So she's standing there, and she's still watching this thing, and this thing is clearly looking at her, she said, but it's looking down because she said this thing is so tall. It's looking down at her like it was leaned over. She said as she was standing there and that thing looking at her, she looking up at it, she noticed to her left some lights from a car coming in from one of the neighbors that was getting off of work. And she said when she seen them lights, that thing growled again and it turned and she said it just messed her head up how far this thing leaped. She said it took one leap, took another leap, and then went down to all fours. And it just ran up into the tree line. She said she turned, she ran in her room, locked her door, and she called her neighbor. First time she said she didn't get an answer. Second time her neighbor picked up. She said, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. She said, calm down, what's wrong? She said, I seen that thing. That's not a dove. That's not a dove. This thing was on my back porch. And it was standing up. It looked like a werewolf. She said, what are you talking about? She said, that thing we seen the other night. It's not a dove. That thing is a werewolf. It was walking. It got arms. It got hands. This is everything that she telling her neighbor. So they go back and forth, talk about this for a few. Then she hang up. The next day, she calls sheriff back out there. And when she calls him back out there, she tells him what she saw. And she said that that's how she know that these people know what is out there. She said, I saw what killed my cats. And it was on my back porch. And he was like, well, what was it? He said, it was a werewolf. And she said that he kind of smirked, like laughed. And she was like, why are you laughing? What you think, I'm crazy? He was like, no. Now I was thinking about something else. She said, no, you wasn't. You did that because of what I told you I saw. And she said, can you please just leave? So he was like, no, I heard what you said and everything. So what you want me to make a report and say you saw a werewolf? Now she said he was trying to act funny. So he said, well, tell me what this thing looked like. And she told him, pointed head, a large head, long snout. She told him everything. Long arms, it had hands, and it had bent back legs. She told him everything she saw what this creature looked like. He said, I can't turn that in to my superiors. So I'll just say a coyote, killed your cats and stuff like that. She said she was so mad and so frustrated that she asked him to leave. They go back and forth. He finally leaves. So she said she started, looking online, trying to research on this stuff. And she said she had found this group that deal with certain stuff. She didn't tell me the name or where was they located at. And she said she had talked to them and they said that they would come out and have a look. But she said after waiting for them for weeks, months, they never showed up. She's still having counters to this day, but not like it was when this thing was on her back porch. And that was her encounter, and that came out of North Carolina. Now, this encounter came from one of my eyewitnesses, and it came from her daughter. Now, her daughter was 15 at the time when she had her encounter. Now, this encounter right here come from my eyewitness, and it came from her daughter, was 15 at the time, and it was in Florida. Now, mind you, my eyewitnesses, just out of respect, asked me not to reveal certain locations, so that's what I do. I'm just grateful just to get that encounter. Now, I'm back to this encounter. This come from a 15-year-old, and it happened in Florida. Now, my eyewitness said that one day when they was coming from school, because during this time, she said her girlfriend used to drive, she had a license and everything. And while she was only 15, I think she said she only had a permit. So she used to drive to school and they used to drive back home. And she said one day when they was driving from school, going to drop her off, she said they drive and they decided, not to go straight home. They decided to make a detour. So she said they make this detour and they go down one of these roads that they never went down before. So they just drive it. Now, mind you, she said on this particular day, it started to rain, not heavy, but it was like a drizzling rain. So she said they driving. So she said while they was driving, she noticed something on the right side of the road. She said it had to be about 40 yards in front of them. So she tell her friend, she say, look at that, slow down. So her friend slows the car down. She driving slow. So they looking at this thing. Now, mind you, the road that they took, they never been on. It's a 2-lane road, but it's no other cars out there. So she telling her friend, look at that. So she said she driving slow. And they look. They see something on the right side of the road. And it's like down in, the little ditch thing. It's standing just right there to where that little ditch go down. And she said, what is it? But it wasn't standing straight up, she said. She said it was like, it was crouched. So she tell her friend, stop. Friend, stop the car. They fascinated now on whatever this is, stooping down on the side there, this ditch thing. So they look, she say, I can't tell what it is, but it looked like She said, is that a hand? It looked like it got something in its hand. She said, no, that ain't a person. It's black. That ain't a human. Is it a bear? All this stuff is going through their mind now. They naming all kind of animals because they don't know what it is. So she said, drive up a little bit more. She said, I'm not going up there because we don't know what this thing is. So they still looking at this thing. She said, that's when this thing started to stand up. And when this thing stood up, she said she yelled from the top of her lungs. She just screamed loud. It was just loud. And her girlfriend was like, what did you? She said, when she did that, boom, this thing turned and it focused on them. She said, whatever this thing had in her hand, it dropped. Now this thing is focused on them in that car. They said this thing came from out near that ditch was, and it stood in the road. She said when this thing stood in the road, it started to walk in their direction. She said that's when her friend put her car in reverse and started to drive backwards slow. So while they driving backwards slow, this thing picks up its pace. So she said, stop the car. She said she stopped the car. When she did that, this thing stopped. Now they staring at this creature. She said this thing looked like a black wolf to them. They could see that this thing had amber colored eyes. They said this thing had long arms. It had hands because they said it was holding something, but they could see this thing hands. They could see that it had claws, but it had canine legs. They watching this thing, and this thing is focused on them. They said that's when this thing started to walk towards them again. While this thing walking towards them, they still sitting there. She don't move the car. Cause now they both scared. They see that this thing is a predator. They say this thing walks and it get about 5 feet from their car and it stopped. She said, and when that thing stood there 5 feet from them, she said she was so scared and terrified that she urinated on herself. She said she didn't mean to do it, but she was so scared that she urinated on herself. They still watching this creature. And this thing is watching them. So it started to walk again. And it walks on the passenger side door. And it stopped. She said when that thing did that, it kneeled down, like bent over, and it looked in her window. She said she stayed focused, looking ahead. She said she could not look this thing in its face. She said when it looked down in that window, she said this thing started to sniff. She said this thing was sniffing hard. She said this thing was even sniffing up at, she said like where the window go up at. She said this thing was sniffing all around the edges. Hard. Like it smelt her. Like it smelt her urine. She said this thing was just sniffing. She said she never saw nothing like this in her life. She said, and while they sitting there and this thing steady sniffing, she said she never should have went down that road in the first place. She should have went straight home. She said this thing just kept sniffing. She said then this thing stood back up. And when it stood back up, it walked around the driver's side. And when it walked around the driver's side, it bent over and it looked in her window. She said, but this thing did not sniff like it did when it was over there where she was at. And she thought that that was strange and odd. She said what seemed like to be our eternity couldn't have been no more than a minute, if that. She said that's when she see car coming in the direction of them. She said that's when this thing just took off. Took off and ran back up into the tree line. They said they sat there for about 5 more minutes because they were so scared to pull off. After that, they pulled off. They turned around. They went back, got back on the road where they was supposed to, and she went and took her home. She got in the house, and she told her mother. Her mother said, why is you late? And she said, sat down, and she told her mother everything that happened and what she saw. And that was her encounter, and that happened in Florida.
Marvin, I don't know how you do what you do, but you sure are good at it. You've got a definite gift.
It's no problem, Vic. Anytime you need me, man, I'm going to be there regardless.
Well, as you know, I really appreciate you coming on, especially under such short notice, like I said. But having said that, thanks again so much for coming back on. Have a great night. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you.